The snow had been falling relentlessly for hours, cloaking our little town in a pristine, almost ethereal blanket of white. It was the kind of winter night that seemed to erase the world, silencing everything except the gentle hiss of snowflakes brushing against the windowpane. I wrapped my hands around the warmth of my tea mug, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. It was late, too late for my son Noah to still be asleep. His sleepwalking episodes always made me uneasy, especially on nights like these, when the world outside seemed both beautiful and treacherous. From across the room, Dan, my husband, snored softly on the couch, oblivious to the subtle creaks and groans of our old house. He had been working extra hours lately, his exhaustion deep and palpable. I didn't have the heart to wake him, even as the familiar unease began to tighten in my chest. A soft thud from upstairs made my heart leap. I set my mug down and hurried to the staircase, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. As I climbed, I tried to reassure myself. Noah's sleepwalking episodes were harmless, usually confined to wandering around his room or occasionally into the hallway. But something about tonight felt different. When I reached his room, the door was ajar, swaying slightly as if caught in a ghostly draft. The bed was empty, the covers crumpled and trailing onto the floor. My pulse quickened. "Noah!" I called softly, stepping inside. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the room, revealing no sign of him. Panic surged as I turned, my gaze darting down the hall. The attic door, usually closed tight, was slightly ajar. My breath caught. Noah hated the attic. He had since he was a toddler. It was the one place he never ventured, not even during his sleepwalking episodes. But as I approached, I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards above, the unmistakable sound of someone moving around. "Noah!" I called again, louder this time. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the air growing colder with each step. The dim bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as I reached the top, casting eerie shadows across the cluttered space. There he was, standing in front of the frosted window, his small figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the moonlight. His hands were pressed to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "Noah," I said softly, stepping closer. "What are you doing up here, sweetheart?" He didn't respond, didn't turn to look at me. His gaze was fixed on something outside, his blue pajamas blending with the icy light around him. My heart clenched as I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He flinched, his body jerking slightly as if waking from a dream. Then he turned, his eyes wide and unseeing, filled with a kind of fear I'd never seen before. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The man. He's calling me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What man, Noah?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm. "He's in the snow," he said, pointing out the window. "He says he's waiting for me." I followed his gaze, peering through the frosted glass. The moonlit yard stretched out before us, silent and untouched, the snow unbroken except for the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. "There's no one there," I said gently, pulling him into my arms. His small body was cold, trembling against mine. "It's just the snow, honey. Let's go back to bed." But even as I spoke, a strange chill crawled up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching. I carried Noah back downstairs, holding him close as we passed Dan, still asleep on the couch. Settling Noah back into bed, I brushed his dark curls away from his face and kissed his forehead. "You're safe," I whispered. "I'm right here." The snow outside coated the world in a muffled silence, the kind of quiet that only winter seems capable of creating. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, but even that sound seemed subdued. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the mug in my hands, the tea long since gone cold. My son Noah, now 18, had been sleepwalking again. It was something he hadn't done in years, and the resurgence of it concerned me more than I wanted to admit. I found myself wondering if the stress of his upcoming graduation and the uncertainty of his next steps might be weighing on him more than he let on. Noah was always one to keep things to himself. It wasn't that he was secretive. He just preferred to carry his burdens quietly. Over the years, I had learned to sense the undercurrent of his emotions, the unspoken tensions he didn't know how to put into words. Lately, I'd felt him drawing closer to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our conversations, once quick exchanges about school or dinner plans, had grown longer, deeper, and more personal. That night, after I'd found him standing in the hallway in the midst of his sleepwalking episode, I guided him back to bed. He didn't wake fully, mumbling something incoherent as I helped him under the covers. But as I sat by his bedside, his hand reached out instinctively, resting on mine, even in his sleep. It was such a simple gesture, yet it hit me harder than I could explain. I stayed there for a while watching him. 18 years old, and yet in that moment, he looked so much like the little boy who used to curl up beside me on the couch, clutching his favorite blanket as he asked me endless questions about the stars. Time had moved so quickly, stealing those moments before I had a chance to fully appreciate them. Lately, I had been keenly aware of the impending changes. In just a few months, Noah would be graduating high school and leaving for college, or whatever path he chose. The thought filled me with equal parts pride and melancholy. He was growing into a thoughtful, capable young man, but the closeness we'd shared during his childhood was changing. Or so I thought. In recent months, Noah had been opening up to me in ways that felt like a return to something we'd lost. He'd linger in the kitchen after dinner, sharing details about his friends, his uncertainties, even his fears. One evening, while helping me fold laundry, he admitted that he wasn't sure if college was the right path for him. I don't know, Mom, he'd said, his voice low. What if I pick the wrong thing? What if I mess it all up? It wasn't easy to see him struggling, but it also felt like a privilege to be the one he trusted enough to confide in. I'd reassured him the best I could, reminding him that he didn't have to have everything figured out yet. Life isn't a straight line, Noah, I told him. It's okay to change your mind, to try things and realize they're not for you. You've got time. He had smiled then, a small, grateful smile that reminded me just how much he still needed me, even as he was learning to stand on his own. That night by the fire, after settling him back into bed, I found myself reflecting on the ways our relationship had evolved. The closeness we shared now was different from the one we'd had when he was a child. Back then I was his guide, his source of answers and comfort. Now it felt more like a partnership, a give and take where I wasn't just teaching him, I was learning from him too. There were times when the closeness felt almost overwhelming, like the night he sat beside me on the couch after a particularly difficult day. He hadn't said much, just rested his head on my shoulder and let out a heavy sigh. I don't know how you do it, he murmured after a while. You always seem to know what to say, even when everything feels impossible. I had laughed softly, brushing his hair out of his eyes like I used to when he was a boy. That's because I've had years of practice, I teased. And because I know you better than you know yourself. His eyes met mine then, filled with a kind of gratitude that made my chest ache. I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom. It wasn't always easy, this closeness. Sometimes it brought with it a weight of responsibility that felt almost suffocating. I wanted to be everything he needed. His anchor, his safe place. But I also knew that part of being his mother meant letting go. He needed to find his own way, to navigate the world without leaning on me for every answer. And yet, the thought of him leaving, of our quiet moments growing fewer and farther between, was almost too much to bear. As I stared at the fire that night, the snow still falling outside, I made a promise to myself, to cherish these moments however fleeting they might be. To hold on to the closeness we'd rebuilt and to trust that, even as he ventured out into the world, the bond we shared would remain. Because no matter how old he got, Noah would always be my son. And I would always be his mother, ready to catch him if he stumbled, to listen when he needed an ear, and to love him with a fierceness that no distance or time could diminish. It was a crisp January morning when Dan packed his suitcase, preparing for a week-long business trip. He kissed my cheek with the same familiar warmth he always did and gave Noah a firm pat on the shoulder before heading out the door. The sound of his car fading into the distance left the house unusually quiet, blanketed in the kind of stillness that comes when one piece of the puzzle is temporarily removed. I tried to ignore the strange flutter of nerves as I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes from breakfast. Noah wandered in a few minutes later, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing his usual flannel pajama pants and a hoodie. At 18, he was taller than me by several inches, his frame sturdy and confident in a way that seemed to blossom almost overnight. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned against the counter, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Of course," I said, smiling back. "Just getting used to the quiet, I guess." He tilted his head, studying me for a moment before nodding. It's weird without Dad here." His observation hung in the air longer than I expected, but I brushed it off. We spent the rest of the morning doing small chores around the house, sharing jokes and talking about mundane things. It felt easy, natural, something I cherished in my relationship with him. As the week progressed, though, I began noticing subtle changes in Noah's behavior. He spent more time around me, finding reasons to linger in the kitchen while I cooked or joining me in the living room when I settled in with a book. It wasn't unusual for him to seek my company, but there was something different about the way he looked at me now, an intensity in his gaze that felt unfamiliar. On the third night of Dan's absence, I decided to make a nice dinner. It wasn't much, a simple pasta dish and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no special occasion. Noah came into the kitchen just as I was plating the food. "Wow," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Fancy." I laughed, brushing a stray curl from my face. "Why not? Feels like we could both use something a little special." He grinned, grabbing the plates and carrying them to the dining table. As we ate, our conversation turned from casual banter to something deeper. He told me about his dreams of traveling, his fears about leaving home, and the uncertainty he felt about what lay ahead. "I just feel like everything's changing so fast," he admitted, swirling his fork in his pasta. "And I don't know if I'm ready." "You don't have to be ready," I said softly. "Change is always going to feel overwhelming at first. But you're stronger than you realize, Noah." He looked up at me then, his eyes holding mine in a way that made my breath catch. "I think I get that from you," he said quietly. His words were simple, but there was something in his tone, something that made my pulse quicken. I laughed it off, trying to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but the feeling lingered. After dinner, we moved to the couch, deciding to watch a movie. Noah sat closer to me than usual, his arm brushing against mine as we shared a bowl of popcorn. The warmth of his presence was comforting but also strangely charged. Halfway through the film, I realized I wasn't paying attention to the screen at all. My focus was on Noah, on the way he glanced at me from the corner of his eye, the way his laughter seemed softer, more deliberate. When our hands brushed reaching for the popcorn, he didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. The tension between us was subtle, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. He was my son after all, and I was just overanalyzing the natural closeness that had developed between us in Dan's absence. But the following evening, as we sat at the dining table finishing dessert, Noah leaned back in his chair and asked a question that made my heart skip a beat. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things were different?" he asked, his voice careful. I frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "Different how?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know. Like, if people didn't have to follow so many rules, if things could just be the way they felt right." His words sent a chill down my spine, not because they were overtly wrong but because of the weight they carried. I didn't know how to respond, so I said the first thing that came to mind. "I think rules exist for a reason," I said, keeping my tone light. "They keep us grounded." He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. I guess." The conversation ended there, but the atmosphere didn't return to normal. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the unspoken thoughts that seemed to hang between us. Over the next few days, the closeness between us grew even stronger. He started helping me with everything: chores, errands, even cooking dinner. He'd sit beside me on the couch at night, his presence a constant reminder of the growing connection between us. It wasn't until Dan returned that I fully realized how much things had changed. Noah's demeanor shifted immediately, becoming more reserved, more distant. He avoided eye contact and spent less time in the house, retreating to his room or heading out with friends. But when our paths did cross, his eyes still held that same intensity, that same unspoken question. It was a look I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried. And deep down, I knew our relationship had crossed an invisible boundary, one I wasn't sure we could ever uncross. That night, the house was quiet, the snowfall outside thick and relentless, blanketing everything in a white silence. I was curled up in bed, trying to lose myself in a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Noah. His sleepwalking episodes had been sporadic, but they always left me uneasy. He hadn't walked around the house in a few nights, but the memory of finding him in strange places lingered. A soft knock on my bedroom door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I called, setting the book aside. Noah stepped into the room, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his sweatpants. His dark hair was messy, and his expression was hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the edge of the bed. He didn't, instead shifting his weight awkwardly. "I was wondering if you could, maybe stay in my room tonight." His request caught me off guard. "Why, sweetheart? Is something wrong?" He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just the sleepwalking. I don't know. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and do something stupid. It'd just make me feel better if you were there." There was something in his tone, an earnestness that tugged at my heart. He rarely asked for help, let alone something so intimate. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course, if it'll help you feel safer." His shoulders relaxed, and he gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Mom." A few minutes later, I followed him to his room. It was tidy as always, his bed neatly made, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting warm light over the space. He had already pulled back the covers on one side, leaving a spot for me. "This feels just like when you were little," I said with a laugh as I climbed in. "You used to come to my room all the time when you were scared." He chuckled softly, lying down beside me. "Yeah, I remember that. You'd always tell me some story until I fell asleep." I smiled, pulling the blanket over myself. "Do you want a story now?" "Tease." "No," he said, his voice quieter, more serious. "Just to hear." We lay there in the quiet warmth of the room, the faint hum of the heater filling the stillness. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but something about the moment felt different, charged in a way I couldn't quite name. Noah's presence next to me was comforting yet unfamiliar. He seemed older, his once boyish energy replaced by the steady calm of young adulthood. "Mom," he said softly, his voice breaking through the silence. I turned toward him, meeting his gaze. His expression was serious, almost vulnerable, and it tugged at something deep inside me. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, running a hand through his messy hair. I've been thinking a lot about how much you mean to me. Especially lately." My heart softened at his words. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching out to brush his hair from his forehead. "You mean everything to me too." "No, it's more than that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You've always been there for me, through everything. And with Dad gone on this trip, I've been feeling closer to you, I guess." There was a sincerity in his words that struck me deeply. Over the past few days, I had noticed the change in him, the way he lingered in conversations, sought out my company, and seemed to hold on to every moment we shared. But now, hearing him say it aloud, I realized just how much he valued our connection. "You're my mom," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But you're also my best friend." I don't know what I'd do without you." The earnestness in his tone filled me with a mix of pride and tenderness. "Noah," I said gently, "you'll never have to find out. I'll always be here for you no matter what." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "No. I wanted to say it. I don't think I say it enough." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "You don't have to say it, Noah. I see it in everything you do." He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the space between us filled with the quiet understanding that only comes from years of shared experiences. In that moment, I saw the depth of his gratitude, his respect, and his love for me as his mother. It was overwhelming in the best way. As he lay back, his head sinking into the pillow, I could see the tension ease from his expression. "Thanks for staying tonight," he said softly, his eyes fluttering shut. "It really helps." "Any time," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he drifted off, I stayed by his side, watching the even rise and fall of his chest. There was a peace in the room now, one that reminded me of when he was little and I'd sit with him through storms or nightmares, reassuring him until he fell asleep. Except now he was grown, his struggles more complex and his needs less straightforward. But my role remained the same, to be his anchor, his source of calm when the world felt uncertain. When I finally returned to my room that night, I couldn't shake the emotions his words had stirred in me. Our bond had always been strong, but this week had shown me just how much it meant to him, too. He was navigating a difficult time, full of transitions and unknowns, and in his way, he was leaning on me as a source of stability. It was a role I was proud to play. The snow continued to fall outside, its quiet beauty mirroring the stillness inside. As I lay in bed, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, an understanding that, no matter how much Noah grew or how far he ventured, our connection would always remain a cornerstone of his life and mine.